thanks, Jim, for talking to me about your new book, which is called
Densokugaku.
Densokugaku. So, for the people who are watching the video and who may not know you, let me give you a quick introduction of Jim. You were born and you grew up in Sydney, where, according to what you write in the book, you learned to play the piano quite early on and also tinkered with electronics before you got into music professionally even. And then you played keyboard and synthesizers in some bands before you went to university, or probably even during your time at university, where you
Parallel with university.
Yeah, where you studied composition and started working in electronic music, and quite quickly, as I understood it, turned to live electronics as your main interest in that time. And you also started to learn to play the shakuhachi during that time. In shakuhachi, your main teachers were Riley Lee, with whom you studied in Sydney already, and then later in Japan, you studied with Teruo Furuya and Yokoyama Katsuya. You've trained in Chikoho and in KSK style shakuhachi, and I think your official license is in KSK, right? You got this from Yokoyama?
That's right. Yeah, from Yokoyama.
Yeah. Then you got a PhD in composition and also worked as a lecturer for a while in Sydney. Before you decided to embark on a career as shakuhachi performer and teacher rather than pursuing a more safe life in the academic world. And you moved to Germany, where you lived from 2004 to 21. And there you were instrumental in setting up the European Shakuhachi Society, which was founded in 2008. And you were also one of the main organizers of the World Shakuhachi Festival in London in 2018. And then in 2021...
Just a little correction. The ESS, the first thing that became the ESS was in 2006 in London. And it was in 2006 that we decided to create the society, and then in the course of 2006 and 2007 it came into being, so that we had the first official ESS summer school in 2007. So 2008 was the World Festival in Sydney, and the ESS already existed by that time.
Okay, I see. That's interesting. I only found the year on the website of the ESS, and there it said 2008. But maybe that was the official document signing.
Someone is rewriting history.
That's quite possible as well. Okay, so in those years you were very instrumental in setting up the ESS. You were also the first chairperson. I think you wrote the articles for the society while it was in the UK before it moved to France recently. And you were one of the main organizers of the World Shakuhachi Festival in London in 2018. And then, yes, in 2021 you moved to Japan, another big change in your life, where you are living now. So, the book, Densokugaku, why this title?
Densokugaku.
What does it mean? For those people who don't speak perfect Japanese.
Well, it's not perfect Japanese because it's not an official Japanese word. It doesn't exist as a Japanese word. Maybe it will in the future. That would be nice. But the three characters are Den, which is one of the readings of the character for electricity. And Soku is one of the readings for breath. The other common reading is Iki. Soku is less common, although we find it in titles like Sokan, breath sight, in the KSK Honkyoku repertoire. And Gaku is one of the words that's used for music. So if we have, for instance, Hogaku, traditional Japanese music, or Gagaku, the court music. So Gaku. So it's the three words, or three characters, meaning electricity, breath, and music. So electric breath music, which for me talks about shakuhachi with live electronics.
Okay. Great.
So that's the reason. We spent a lot of time trying to work out what to call the book. I originally wanted to call it Silicon and Bamboo, which was a play on the words of silk and bamboo, koto and shakuhachi, but silicon and bamboo for electronics and shakuhachi. But the chief editor of the publisher decided it sounded too much like silicone breast implants.
Oh, okay.
So he decided that it would be best not to have that association. I agreed. I never thought of that. That definitely wasn't in my mind. But he said, no, we don't want that, so please come up with something else. So I spent a lot of time playing around with ideas with my wife, who's Japanese, until we came up with this combination that she said, well, you could call it that if you want. And it worked, and the publisher said, oh, I like that, so that's what it ended up being.
Okay. Yeah, very interesting. So those are the main themes in the book and of your work. So electronics, shakuhachi, composition. You decided to take a slightly unusual stylistic approach for the book. So it's not an academic treatise, it's not a biography or an autobiography. It's sort of a mixture of different genres, so to speak. Why did you make that choice?
Well, the initial impulse came from the editor at the publisher, who actually approached me initially to write the book. I didn't approach the publisher, and in fact, this particular editor is known within the shakuhachi world. John Palmer, a composer, English composer, who has put in sort of little cameo appearances at various shakuhachi events, including, for instance, the summer school, ESS Summer School in 2014 in Radolfzell, which I organised. I commissioned him. It was an unpaid commission, but he was generous enough to do it. I commissioned him to write a new piece, to be performed at that festival. And Jean-François Lagrotte premiered that in Radolfzell. And then I was able to program the same piece with Jean-François also playing it in London in 2018. So John has had a connection with the shakuhachi world. Also prior to that, he had composed various other pieces for shakuhachi with Yoshikazu Iwamoto playing the shakuhachi a long time ago now. So John knows the shakuhachi. And when I gave him a copy of the CD, which features also in the book, Songs from the Lake, which I recorded in 2020, he said, well, it'd be interesting to put out a book explaining how you came to be doing that. Mm-hmm. And so the impulse was not to try and do a second doctorate or something like that, but a book which explains how that came about. Mm-hmm. And so as I thought about it, I thought, well, no, I can't write purely an autobiography because I have to talk about the music. Mm-hmm. I can't write purely an academic treatise because I have to talk about the personal background, how I came to do this. I can't talk purely about that CD because it has its roots, a lot of it, even though it doesn't sound like Honkyoku, a lot of the technique of the shakuhachi has its roots in Honkyoku. So I had to talk about Honkyoku. And then also along the way I had to talk about the technology that was used as well. Otherwise, it made no sense talking about music with electronics without talking a bit about the electronics. And then finally, as I was thinking about all of this, I realized that I really had to include some information about why I wanted to do it in the first place and what composing and performing actually means for me. So I tried to find a form which combined all of these different approaches or these different aspects. And the approach that I came up with was main chapters which start off being somewhat autobiographical but then move into the more musicological and then analytical, discussing the pieces. And then finally a chapter about what for me is the spirituality of the shakuhachi. But interspersed between all of these were interludes, shorter interludes, which are still, nevertheless, valid chapters, which are far more personal. They're more anecdotes which illustrate things that were important for me, connections that were important, ideas, encounters, particularly with Yokoyama, for instance, personal encounters that were important to me. and then also reactions to the things that I've done, particularly songs from the lake. So I ended up with this structure which is really a mix of a lot of different things, and therefore hopefully is something that a lot of different people can approach, because there's hopefully interesting reading material in there about the shakuhachi, perhaps about me, but that's not so important, but about the shakuhachi. And there's also information about the classical pieces, about Honkyoku. My idea about how the Honkyoku are composed as much as anything else. I treat them as compositions and analyze them as compositions, or analyze a couple of pieces as compositions, because those are influences on me. And so there's that sort of material. And then there's also the discussions of my own music. So it addresses a lot of different things in a lot of different ways. And hopefully people from different fields and different areas of music or artistic interest will find something in the book which they can relate to, or which attracts them.
It sounds so for me personally, maybe I should say that the topics are very interesting. Of course, shakuhachi, Honkyoku, electronic music. I can relate to that very well, and I took a lot of that from the book as well. Still, it's an unusual combination. So, but I think it works really well. So, when I read the book, I really enjoyed this. That you touch on these things and go into a certain depth, but not too deep, so that it gets too technical. And so I think it even though it's unusual, it works very well. I think that was my impression. And I also liked, which I think I remarked as well, that it is quite short. It's 132 pages, which is good. I think sometimes books are a bit too long. So, but I found that very good as well. Okay.
I had to make a decision somewhere in there about the length of the book. I could, if I'd wanted to, have spent a lot more time with analysing more pieces and including more detailed different kinds of pieces as well. But that wasn't what I wanted to say. So I really decided to reduce to the essentials, to say what I wanted to say, and then left it at that, rather than inflating it to a larger, more academic sort of, like a second doctoral dissertation or something like that. I decided I didn't want to go to that territory. I just said what I had to say, and that was enough.
Yeah, I very much appreciate that. For me, it was the perfect length. Nevertheless, there is a lot in the book, and I think I discovered 4 main topics, which we also already touched on. The first one is shakuhachi and Honkyoku. Then there is electronic music, and in particular live electronic music. Your life as a composer, I think, would be a third topic. And then, as you already talked about as well, the spiritual underpinnings of all of this and what brings all of this together as well, I think. So we don't have a lot of time. I think it would be easy to talk for a few hours about this, at least for me. But let's go through these 4 areas. So in sequence to try to give this a bit of a structure. So let's start with Honkyoku and shakuhachi. Maybe you can talk a bit about what is your fascination with shakuhachi, with Honkyoku. Why did you get into it? It took up a great part of your life, and you spent a lot of energy trying to get good at shakuhachi, and you integrated into your compositional work. Why?
That's actually the title of the last chapter of the book.
Yeah,
Why?
Pretty much, exactly.
No, the way it started for me was actually at university. I was a composition student, composition major, but I had to study ethnomusicology as well. That was part of the deal at Sydney University. And the lecturer in ethnomusicology was, he's still alive, so is, an expert in Japanese music, amongst other things. And he played us recordings of Honkyoku, of Yamaguchi Goro. And this is in the 1970s, mid-1970s, so there wasn't much opportunity to see this live. But I heard recordings and thought, this is really interesting, but I don't know what's going on. I didn't understand it, so I wanted to learn more about it. without really doing much about it for a long time. That long time, I spent a lot of that in Europe as a postgraduate composition student. But when I came back to Sydney in 1986 to finish my master's and then work on my PhD, Riley Lee had come to Australia in that same year to write his PhD with Alan Merritt, with the lecturer in ethnomusicology. And so I met Riley at the university, heard concerts, heard performances of him playing Honkyoku. And also important was that I was just at that time starting to live at Sydney Zen Centre. I'd become very interested in Zen. So I was living in this Buddhist centre where Riley was playing once a week, teaching students. So I heard it a lot in the background, and eventually I thought, I really ought to try this. And so I asked Riley if he'd take me on as a student, which of course he did, because he was making his living as a teacher, as we all do. But I said, I want to do this seriously. Please get me a good flute. I'll pay, of course, but I want a good instrument, not just a student instrument. I want a reasonable instrument, because I was working as a professional composer at the same time. So and Riley said, fine, no problem, organised it all. But very soon after I'd started, this was with Shakuhachi Honkyoku originally, I found that, firstly, I connected to the music. I felt a sense of connection there and started gradually to understand what was going on. And decided very soon that I wanted to take it as far as I possibly could, which included the idea also fairly early of eventually going to study with Yokoyama, who at the time was still alive, and who had been, after Chikuho, Riley's main teacher. So that was the logical step, which happened in the the mid-1990s. My first trips to Japan were in early 1990s, and I worked with Furuya a little bit then, just once actually. Okay. But then after that, I worked with Furuya and Yokoyama. But that meant that I was exposed to Chikuho Honkyoku, and then more and more to KSK Honkyoku with Riley, and then later with Furuya and Yokoyama. And those were musics which resonated with me. And so I decided, as I said early on, and never regretted the decision, to spend the hours that are needed and do the work to try and become as good as possible, with the idea that I might eventually like to treat it as a main, or if not the main, element of my musical life. Mm-hmm. Which is what happened for a long time, because then, for various personal reasons, which are too complex to go into now, I ended up in Germany. I prepared the ground from 2018, gradually setting up concert tours and then spending sabbatical semesters and so on in Germany, because I was working as a university lecturer. But I then set up enough teaching and performing to be able to live from shakuhachi. Which I did for almost 20 years, basically. Yeah. Uh-huh. But at the same time, I was still a composer. And so, particularly after I'd set things up and we'd started the ESS, I was working more and more on the idea of shakuhachi and live electronics, because I'd been working as a live electronics composer. Mm-hmm. So that probably brings us to the second topic.
Well, it almost could, but I want to quickly ask about your idea of entanglements, which you elaborate a bit in the book, which is, as I understand it, one of the main ways in which you think that a Honkyoku piece has a certain structure or maybe a certain coherence, in that it links certain phrases which with each other, not necessarily by repeating musical material or motives, as I would assume this is the main way to do it in Western music, but more in terms of textures, or that one property of the shakuhachi maybe that people are not quite familiar with is that you have different fingerings for the same pitch, which have a very different sound color. So you can play this, you can repeat the same pitch but play it differently, or maybe you can continue with the same sound color but with a different pitch. Is this kind of what you mean by entanglement?
Those are the kinds of connections. Yeah. Now, what I mean with the notion of entanglement is it's actually a result of the simplicity of the construction of the shakuhachi. For those that don't know the shakuhachi, you have 5 finger holes and a blowing edge on a bamboo tube, and that's it. You have no keys, you have no tuning mechanism, nothing, basically. So everything has to be done by the body of the performer. Now, these 5 holes generally produce a pentatonic scale. So on the basic instrument, the usual instrument, D, F, G, A, C, and then it repeats in the second octave and part of the third octave. Those are tones that you can produce by what you could call a normal playing position, which is the kari playing position. Everything else in between, you have to modify the playing position, the head, blowing angle, support, lots of different things are used to modify the pitch so that you can actually you can produce any pitch microtonally anywhere between all of these basic tones. But the result of this modification is that you get a totally different timbre and dynamic with the so-called meri, the bent tones. So the tangling is that as soon as you try and get a different pitch apart from the straight kari tones, you're automatically affecting dramatically the tone color and the dynamic of the tone. And you can't avoid it. So you have to live with this. The way to live with it, this is my impression, this is the thing that influenced me as a composer. The way to live with it is you turn this limitation, if you want to view it one way, into a virtue. And this is for me what the Honkyoku do, that if you play the pitches, and for me this is an important point, play the pitches particularly of very deep notes, that you bend deeply so that they actually touch the same pitch. As you said before, you can play the same pitch with different fingerings and so on. If they touch the same pitch as the main kari notes, then you end up with a chain of linkages between phrases, often with the same tone played with a different tone color, and sometimes with, as you said, with the same tone color, a meri type tone color, playing different notes. But you end up with this chain of meri kari, meri kari, meri kari, which in the analyses that I present in the book, and this is where it does turn into a musicological treatise, you can see that there are these linkages which create a line which runs through an entire piece. So rather than just being exclusively individual phrases that exist by themselves or individual notes, there is another dimension. And this is where you get a linkage that creates an entire structure and an entire form out of the individual phrases. The individual phrases are, of course, important. You have to shape each note and you have to shape each phrase. But this combination of meri kari and this, what I've called entanglement, the mutual influence of dynamics, tone color, pitch in these two different areas creates an entire background structure of the pieces. And I present a couple of examples of how that works in the book. So that's this idea of entanglement for me, that influencing one aspect of a sound, its pitch, will influence everything else. And there are different ways of doing it so that you can create lots of different tone colors and textures and shadings through very fine, very subtle movements with the shakuhachi. Therefore, it's for me a very embodied instrument, something that really involves body focus in order to play properly.
Yeah. So many points I could take from this. So let's take this one. Moving a bit towards live electronics. So you said there are certain guiding principles, basically determined by shakuhachi and also which are used in Honkyoku. When you add electronics or live electronics to this, do you transfer these guiding principles to the live electronics to stay within the system, or are you using this to add something to what's offered by the shakuhachi?
Well, actually both. That necessarily, when I'm playing shakuhachi, even if it's improvised, then I'm moving between these meri and kari tone color areas, because that's what you have to do if you want to play anything more than straight pentatonic scales. That's the way the instrument works. It's not a Western flute which has been designed so that all semitones in a 12-tone equal-tempered octave sound the same, more or less. Yes. It's been designed, or the shakuhachi is developed, so that you get these quite dramatic differences. So automatically, that is part of the playing. Working with live electronics creates for me, or that is adding additional processing to the shakuhachi, creates another layer again on top of this, on top of the innate textural fluidity of the shakuhachi by itself. Processing it creates another layer of texture, which also can have its own senses of fluidity, partly steered by the shakuhachi, controlled by the shakuhachi, because that's the source material that gets processed. But then, of course, you can do whatever your electronics is set up to be able to do. Filtering, changing overtone structures, changing dynamics, delaying, overlapping, layering, looping, whatever you want to do, as an addition to it. So it's a combination of both. The shakuhachi in its, let's call it pure form, is necessarily a part of what happens with the electronics. And the electronics, for me, in the way I use it, this is certainly not the only way of doing it, of course, but the way I use it adds to that. And my intention is that sometimes you can't really tell whether it's the shakuhachi or the electronics, which is playing a note.
Mm-hmm. So this means you're not purely using the electronics as a means of processing the shakuhachi sound, but also adding purely electronic sounds. I'm just trying to figure out if it's just modification of shakuhachi or if it's more of an interaction between the two. Well, I mean, it will be.
I tried both, and in the CD that's discussed in detail in the book, Songs from the Lake, some movements are really purely shakuhachi. Everything is derived in real time from the shakuhachi in some of the movements. Mm-hmm. In others, I'm playing with electronic instruments simultaneously. Mm-hmm. For instance, one of the movements is for theremin and shakuhachi played simultaneously. I found that you can adjust the sensitivity of the theremin so that you can effectively dance around it and control it. Takes a bit of practice, but it can be done. So playing the shakuhachi and the theremin simultaneously, and then processing the shakuhachi to a limited degree, but the theremin perhaps to a lot more degree, and creating then a parallel sound world to the shakuhachi. What I'm in such movements in the piece, in the work, in Song from the Lake, and in other pieces that I've done, what I've tried to do then, initially more or less unconsciously, but then gradually more and more consciously, is to make use of this idea of different timbral blocks, timbral structures, that oscillate between one another, perhaps on a longer time scale than within the shakuhachi phrases, but nevertheless taking this idea of having different kinds of timbre which can morph into one another, and using that as something which is produced not only by the shakuhachi with processing, but also by electronic instruments as an additional layer. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So it's a combination of these different approaches. So that what I find myself working with more and more is a kind of hyper shakuhachi, where I've got the shakuhachi and whatever processing, and then some other performing interface, like a theremin or a touch-sensitive strip or keyboard or something like that I can touch with one finger while I'm playing the shakuhachi.
That's very, very interesting. So you mentioned embodiment. For me, there are sort of two aspects that I thought of while I was reading the book. One is this more like Zen perspective on embodiment, but maybe we can come to this a bit later. The other is that me growing up in Germany, of course, Kraftwerk for me is a very important cultural thing. You can't escape it if you're interested in electronic music and grew up in this culture here. And they have a notion of the man-machine, where basically you have a human and then you have the machine, whether it's electronic or maybe it's mechanic or whichever way, right? So let's just call it a machine, or maybe it's a robot these days, or disembodied AI these days, actually, something like that. And for me, it was always more of a conversation between the two. And then as a symbiosis, something new emerges from this. Is this something you can relate to, or would you say your approach is a bit different?
I can relate to the idea, but it's not necessarily what I want to do. My feeling about embodiment is it actually developed before I even started playing shakuhachi. I was really interested in performing music. I wasn't so much interested purely in composing for the purpose of writing a score which then hopefully gets played by someone, maybe not. Maybe it lives in a desk drawer for decades before anything happens to it, if one is lucky. But that sort of intellectual approach to composing wasn't so interesting for me. I wanted to play. And so it became a question, how can I play? Mm-hmm. Well, initially I was a keyboard player, not a terribly good keyboard player, but nevertheless a keyboard player. And so I wanted to play my instruments, which included the electronic instruments. So the idea of the man-machine, Mensch-Maschine, whatever you want to call it, is not so much the idea of a symbiosis between the technology and myself as a person. I never imagined myself having a chip in my brain, for instance. Not so much that, but using the technology as an instrument, not as a tool to be sharpened, honed in whatever way one wants, and then used to create something. More or less like I would think that Stockhausen used the tools of tape recorders and so on to create a work like Kontakte. But as an instrument which is played not necessarily with the same kind of gestures and so on as a keyboard or whatever is played, but it's something that you have to do something to actively in real time to make it make sound. Mm-hmm. So that was my starting point. And so this idea of playing was something that grabbed me with the shakuhachi because of this closeness to the breath, dependency on the body, how you support using the abdominal muscles, how you use your toes, how you use everything in the body to support the sound of the shakuhachi. The idea of playing really grabbed the whole of the body for me, and so this was an important point, an entry point into the shakuhachi. What grew in parallel to that, and this is coming in the other direction, was the thought, what can I do with the electronics which would have a similar degree of embodiment, not necessarily with breath, although I tried it with breath controllers and things, but not necessarily the same kind of breathing as an instrument, but the same kind of level of embodiment, something that you had to play also with the whole of body, support and control of the whole of the body. And I spent time playing with different concepts, not just keyboards, but ribbon controllers and wind controllers, breath controllers as well. And eventually, as I actually described in the book, I came across more or less by chance the theremin as an idea. And for me, the theremin plus various forms of processing is like the electronic, well, not equivalent, but the partner to the shakuhachi, because it has to be played also with extreme body control, not with the breath. The breath doesn't have anything to do with creating the sound, although your sense of breathing is also important in playing the theremin. But for me, it was not so much finding a symbiosis between person and machine, but finding an instrument or instruments and combinations, which would allow for the same degree of bodily contact is the wrong word with the theremin, but bodily relationship with the process of making music that I found within the shakuhachi. So that was more my approach, rather than the idea of a symbiotic human-machine combination.
Okay. Yeah, that's interesting. I was wondering why you focus so much on the theremin and not, I don't know, you can have gloves, right? Or you can have resistance capacitor or something like that, right? Measuring skin resistance. Or these days you can, some people like to use plants for their modular synthesizer as a source for control voltages, something like that. But you seem to have drawn, I don't know, a line more or less strictly, I don't know, with something like the theremin, and then you have something, so in the book you also mentioned the Continuum Mini, which for those who don't know, it's basically just a control strip where you Yeah.
Oh, look, here's one here.
That's exactly, yeah. So you place a finger, and this basically gives you, let's call it data or control voltage, and then you can use this to shape the music or to shape the sound. So this seems to be what you settled on. Of course, you could have added a lot more to your body, right? So why did you choose to do it like this?
There are various reasons for that. Firstly, of course, I have no intention of asserting dogmatically that the sort of things that I do are the only possible things. All of these things that you've mentioned, body sensors, video sensing, and so on and so on and so on, are all perfectly valid ways of making music. There is a specific difference which attracted me to the theremin. It's a couple of technical points. One is the simplicity of the circuitry involved. It's basically a combination of a couple of radio receivers, which are detuned with one another. Yeah. If you go back to the original analog theremin designs, it's a very simple circuit. There's not much in the box. So I like the simplicity. As opposed to something which has literally billions of semiconductor junctions in it. Mm-hmm. So it's a different feel for me to, say, a digital piece of electronics. Although I, of course, use digital. There's a Continuum Mini there, which has the billions of transistors in it.
Indeed, yes.
However, one important point in the theremin is that it's a bit conceptual, but the body actually becomes part of the circuit. What you're doing, for those who are technically oriented, the proximity of the hands to the antennae of the theremin change the capacitance of what's effectively a variable capacitor, or two variable capacitors, which change then frequencies, which then eventually result in the analog signal that comes out of the thing. Now, because you're actually part of a capacitor, you're part of the process of charging and discharging the capacitor in this oscillating process. The body is actually part of the circuit which is making the signal, not just controlling the circuit making the signal, but is part of the signal-generating circuitry. For me, that's a sort of conceptual parallel to the body being part of the shakuhachi. Your breath is part of the shakuhachi, your body is part of the circuit of the theremin. And so I liked this parallel, what for me is a parallel between the two. Of course, you can argue lots of different ways about this, whether that's true or not. That was just what occurred to me and what attracted me to it.
Yeah, fair enough.
And I enjoyed playing theremin.
Yeah, fair enough. I mean, of course, you can make the same argument for a skin resistance measure thing like that, right? But
if that's being used as part of not just as a sensor circuit, but as part of an oscillator or filter circuit, yeah, of course. And there are instruments out there that are designed around that concept, definitely. Another aspect, though, was something that I'd learned through shakuhachi, not just learning shakuhachi, but learning through shakuhachi, just how much work is involved in attaining some kind of mastery of an instrument. How much time you have to spend with your instrument. I don't have that many lifetimes to spend on shakuhachi, and then on a piano, and then on a theremin, and then on I do play Continuum Mini, but and then on a set of body sensors, and so on, and so on, and so on. There's a limit. And so I found that I just had to make a decision about where I was going to put my energies. I feel overstretched anyway. I play too many. I try to play too many instruments in any event. But
I know I
had to draw the line somewhere. And the line was particularly because I was attracted conceptually to this thing with the theremin. The line stopped at the theremin and at the analog synthesizers and related things that I'd already learned. The Continuum Mini is... it's not like a theremin. You're not part of the generating circuits. You're controlling it. It senses your pressure and position of fingers and so on. But for me, it has a little bit of the feel of a theremin, even though it's not conceptually the same thing. So I sort of allowed that into my my world, along with the various keyboard or modular-related instruments that I also use and have.
Yeah. Again, very interesting. I have to be conscious of the time a bit. So again, I could ask so many questions about this, but maybe let's move on a bit more towards the compositional side of things. Let's maybe start with one of the remarks from the book that you said. You try to play with live electronics as much as possible, but sometimes because of necessity and performance constraints, you record a backing track and then you play to the backing track. And then the remark you made is that when you go about it this way, playing towards a pre-recorded backing track, you say the limitations are mainly in the temporal shaping. So this means, so to elaborate maybe a bit more, of course, when you play to something pre-recorded, lots of things are set, right? So you cannot modify pitches, maybe in the performance situations, you would like to play something a bit sharper, right? This would be conceivable. Or you cannot modify the texture or the timbre or something like that. And of course, you can also not influence the rhythm anymore. All of this is set. But in this remark, you said the limitations are mostly temporal. So the other dimensions don't seem to be, you don't seem to experience as quite so limiting in this setting. Can you explain this a bit?
Firstly, the idea of where I came from with that, I can actually illustrate particularly from one of the pieces that I describe in the book, Again the Stars, which actually started as an improvisation, but I then notated it. Now, that exists in several versions. There's the original recording version, which was on one of my CDs. Then I took that recording, notated the shakuhachi, which had started as a sort of structured improvisation, and used that in combination with basically the recording stripped of the shakuhachi. The shakuhachi left out of the recording, but everything else there. Now, in that recording, there were certain points where certain events that were actually originally percussive tones or pizzicato tones on a double bass that my musical partner Michael Atherton played, and I sampled and then dropped in at the points that I wanted them. So those were at particular points that correlated to points within the shakuhachi line. And it wasn't just random, they were placed specifically. Now, with that recorded version, of course, they're always going to be in the same place, which means that you have to reach the same point in the shakuhachi, or the corresponding point in the shakuhachi line, at that time, which means you're actually sitting there looking at a stopwatch. Which means that you don't have very much flexibility in the timing of the phrases. Mm-hmm. And so that's a prime example for me of this as limitation of the timing. Now, in that sense, the rest of the material of that piece was composed, or in the final version of it is composed. The shakuhachi is a line that you can play. The notation exists. You can play it as a piece, not just an improvisation, but read the notes. The electronics is mainly a sort of very highly variegated drone texture, very complex drone with a lot of movement and differentiation within it. But there are these specific points within it. And there's also slight changes of pitch within the drone as well, which relate to the shakuhachi. Now, in the later versions of that, I then stripped out, subsequent versions, I stripped out the pizzicato tones and just used the drone pre-recorded, and then using a small synthesizer, played just single tones with a finger at the pizzicato point.
Yeah.
So I gave myself more flexibility in time because I could then put those events wherever I wanted. The ideal is actually to play it as a live version with two performers. And actually last year in Stuttgart at the concert that Riley Lee and I gave, I played that piece with two of my students who also have their Shihan Nenjo, Alexander Kraus and Nina Hara, who played alternate phrases, and I played the drone and the rest of the electronics live. Now, in that form, even though we were still playing the same textural material and the same progression of the dynamics and timbre and so on within the electronics part, I was adding the pizzicato notes at whatever time those two players got to where the points were needed. So they had total flexibility. I was fitting in with them in playing the electronics. That's sort of the other extreme of it, where everything is done live with either one performer playing the whole of the shakuhachi part, or in that case with two performers, and then me playing the electronics live. So while I retained the compositional aspects of the drone and these pizzicati and the shakuhachi line, in that case we had total flexibility of the timing, and that's the kind of flexibility that I'm talking about. What you're talking about is another aspect as well, which is also for me just as important, and shows up in some of the pieces from Songs from the Lake, or in a lot of the pieces from Songs from the Lake, which started off as improvisations, which I then refined by playing them a lot and playing versions of them at festivals and so on over the years. It took me about 12 years to make that CD, to refine everything to the point where I could finally record it. But I have elements that I knew I wanted to have there, but then a high degree of flexibility about exactly what notes, exactly what timbral change occurred at what point, changing between different kinds of timbres, much like Mary Curry for shakuhachi, but between different overtone structures and so on in the electronics. And that then became, on the one hand, on the CD, a sort of definitive version, but then in taking it beyond the CD, I could take the pieces and program it partly in digital electronics, not a lot of the analog electronics because it was easier to carry around, but program it so that I was using applications that allowed me to perform it live, but with the flexibility of exactly what tones happened where in the shakuhachi, or semi-improvise the tones, and also semi-improvise the electronics textures. So in that case, there is a lot more flexibility of the timbral, textural, melodic structures as well.
Okay.
And that's a further point. But the point that was most important for me, and this goes back to the Honkyoku, for instance, there you have set phrases. You're supposed to play, well, they're not notes in the normal sense, in Western sense, but you're supposed to play what's there or what you've learned with your teacher. But that varies in time. That the ma between the phrases and the ma within the phrases varies as well. So for me, even in the Honkyoku, beyond this aspect of the melodic lines of the phrases and through the piece, it's and the connections between the phrases, which I analysed in the book, it's also very importantly a matter of the feeling of time in the pieces, which you have flexibly there. It's based on your breath, of course, but you have flexibly. So in working with the electronics, that aspect of time from the Honkyoku became an important thing for me. So that's why my emphasis is placed very much on that. It's not to deny that there are these other possibilities with the electronics, because they actually occur in the pieces that I'm using. It's just that was my main emphasis, or my main affinity is on this feeling of time. As I said in the book, my initial question when I first started composing was, what is time? I became interested in this concept. What on earth, or anywhere, is time? Which is, of course, something that no one can answer. You can talk about relativity theory and so on, all you like, time dilation and so on, but you still can't say what time is.
Exactly. Yeah, these seem to be two big questions for you. What is time? And then also the pitches between the keys, is as you described it, which is, as you said, you started out as a keyboard player and then you were wondering what happens between the keys. So I can relate to these guiding principles very strongly as well.
Of course, the shakuhachi is also a supremely between the keys oriented instrument.
Indeed, yes. It's a bit of a sometimes I think it's a bit of a shame that it's so easy to play all these pitches, but then especially in KSK style you're trained to play exact pitches, so you have to get the tsumeri right, and then there is some flexibility.
Yeah, but there's flexibility there as well.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
There's always glides, and also, as I pointed out in the book, and this of course refers specifically to KSK, but also to Chikuho. Chikuho adheres basically to the same principles. Particularly the daimeri notes, what Yokoyama called the double meri steps, they have to be really super exact. And you get hit on the head if you don't do it.
Indeed.
But there's more flexibility in the single meri, so it will vary from player to player, from performance to performance by the one player. So there is still a certain degree of fluidity. And of course there's all the nice little glides and nayashis and yuri and all the rest of the things in fushi at the end of the tones and so on that you find in KSK as well. So it's KSK is interesting because it's somewhere between these sort of total fluidity and a sense of stability. And for me, this sense of stability, particularly of the double meritones, is what creates compositions out of individual collections or collections of individual phrases. It's what creates an entire form, musical form, which I think the KSK pieces exhibit. Not only the KSK pieces, of course. Would never assert that only KSK Honkyoku are the valid Honkyoku. I'm not dogmatic like that.
Yeah. No, exactly. I see it exactly the same way, and I found your analysis of the Honkyoku very, very interesting. Because these are the points you work out in the analysis of the Honkyoku. I don't know if there is a short answer to this question, but I'd like to ask it anyway. So when I was reading the book, I sometimes thought that you call this process composition, and of course that's a valid description of what you're doing. For me, composition means, as you said earlier, right? Writing sheet music, giving it to performers and hoping that it will be performed by somebody else. A lot of what you're doing, or a lot of your process, for me, I would describe more as music production. So for example, as you also described, you do an improvisation, then you work on it, you transcribe it, and then this becomes the performance, or you put it onto a CD, right? So this would be more music production type of processes. Still, I think you would describe yourself as a composer. Is there anything in this distinction, or how do you see it?
I think that the definition of composition, particularly in the course of the 20th century and into the 21st, has become very fluid. So that, of course, there's the very strict, almost Germanic concept of composition, which is what you're saying. I'm not saying that that's bad being Germanic or something like that. I lived in Germany for a long time, so I'm not worried about it. But, there's this feel that that is what a composer does, and that everything else is not really composition. But I think there's been a great deal of questioning of it, particularly in the 20th century, to the point where improvisation, structured improvisation, development of pieces through improvisation is now considered to be an equally valid means or description of music creation as composition, and so that as the strict formal Musikhochschule, composition. Yeah. And so I think that any term, composition understood in a more contemporary sense, or music creation or music production, are three terms that are almost 100% overlapping.
Okay.
And so I just choose to call myself a composer because that's what I started life as,
right? At least
in terms of my studies. But one point that I would like to make about that is that it's not actually something that's exclusive to the 20th century and 21st century. Interestingly enough, in the past 20 years or so, going back to the 19th century, there have been some very, very well-prepared editions of particularly romantic composers of their music. And one that sticks in mind, and particularly in this question, is the piano works of Chopin. Mm-hmm. Now, these, turns out, exist, even though it's called the same piece, one of the nocturnes or something like that, in variants that are wildly divergent from one another. Totally different sheet musics where they'll have common points, but the material between is totally different. The only reasonable assumption is that Chopin himself or someone else has notated and then worked over structured improvisations, which have the established points, which is then played on the piano, but with other material, whatever is felt like improvising between those established points. It's exactly the same process, using a different instrument. It's called composition. You wouldn't find anyone in a Hochschule anywhere that would say, oh no, Chopin wouldn't be a composer, he'd be a music producer. So it's actually, I think, a point which disappears ultimately. And I use composition, calling myself a composer and calling the process composition, as a convenient label.
That makes a lot of sense. I sometimes with music have the impression, similar to linguistics, which I worked in a long time, that there was a certain push towards a scientification of the discipline, where in linguistics you wanted to differentiate yourself from literature studies, and so you said, this is the data, so the sentences, and we analyze the sentences, and now we're scientific. And in music, I feel a parallel development may have been, I'm not an expert in academic types of looking at music, but my impression is that at some point there was this idea, there is this written thing, and now we can analyze the written thing, and this will make everything more scientific. And so this had a big influence on how composition and all of that is seen.
Is perceived. But, I've actually made the point in a couple of publications. Really, that is a limited concept of music creation. And I've actually gone as far as calling Western music, academic Western music, an ethnic music generated in Western cultures. And there are other classical music. There's Japanese classical music, there's Indonesian classical music, there's Indian classical music, and so on, which are all totally different. And they all have different approaches to composing, or the notion of, let's not even call it composing, the notion of music creation. And Western music really actually is another ethnic music, if you look at it in that way.
Indeed.
Amongst them. And its concepts are also ethnic concepts.
Indeed.
There are a lot of people that might not like hearing that said in that way, but I don't care.
Yes, I completely agree. And I think if you look at big YouTubers like Adam Neely, who does a lot about music theory, he sees it exactly like that as well. So he says, this is just one type of music, and we just need to be aware that all these other cultures have their own music, and it's not just Western music. So, yeah. Okay. But unfortunately, we don't have a lot of time left. I wanted to come to the Zen aspect, or the Zen Buddhist underpinnings, if you like, of your work a bit. At some point in the book, you say that you see learning shakuhachi and composing as shugyo. So this is life discipline of personal, spiritual development. So, of course, work life is not completely separate from the personal life, especially if you work in if you're pursuing an artistic endeavor. But do you see your personal development and your professional development just as two sides of the same coin? And what influence does your
I find the two very difficult to separate. In a sense, it's funny. So when I try and be a bit sort of introspective, I have nothing that I'd really call hobbies. It's all just music. So I just do music. I'll read a book and things like that. But I can't say I'm a hobby stamp collector or something like that. And also my work. I can't say I'm a hobby shakuhachi teacher, because that doesn't work as a concept. For me, the areas of personal and in my case, the artistic work, really are very difficult to separate. I'm not saying that my approach is the only approach. Again, I don't want to be dogmatic about that in any way, but I find it difficult to separate the two. It's always been a process of questioning and searching for me, and that's something that I also point out in the book. There's the idea of search. And one of my early steps in searching was that I got very interested in Zen, in Buddhism in general, and then particularly in Zen because it offered a practice, specifically through Zazen, through meditation, which felt like it was approaching the question that I'd continually had, what is time? What is time? You focus on the moment. Zazen is about being in the moment. So it related to my question. So it felt like a logical step for me. And then to find a music which focused on the moment very much in the same way, Shakuhachi, was another revelation and another level of involvement of the same question. So everything sort of wrapped itself around these questions and these processes. One thing that I found more and more, also in working with Zen meditation, was how important the body is there as well. So focusing on one's breathing, for instance, as a primary practice, or working with a koan, connecting the koan with one's breath. They're primary elements of Zen meditation. Breath is one of the fundamental processes, of course, of the body. And focusing on the breathing means connecting your body with the moment, being in the body in the moment, which is something that I see one being able to do in music. And so, for me, the process, or these discoveries between Zen and music and my fundamental questioning were logical steps. They were steps that felt like they made sense to me. But of course, one develops, one learns as one goes, one hopefully deepens one's perceptions, one's concepts as well. And the deepening in particular for me was in working with both Zen and with Shakuhachi, and then by extension with composition, was that on the one hand there's this process of focusing inwards, focusing on the moment, one-pointedness, and on inwards into the body, onto your breath. But even in Zen, you always have to come out of that point as well. You don't stay in the still, quiet place. The Buddha didn't stay in the still, quiet place. Otherwise, he could have just disappeared into nirvana after his awakening. He stuck around for another almost 60 years as a teacher. So he came out from the quiet place. You have to come out. Musically, that means also, for me, coming out of the moment of the sound into the extension of the sound into an entire piece, which relates for me to the idea of composition. So how composition in its broadest sense, which I've just described, so how you create music which extends over a period of time, which focuses on the moment and contains this moment-to-moment absolute pointedness, one-pointedness, which is what we learn in playing shakuhachi, but also extends it out, which is also what we can learn in playing shakuhachi. And which I think is important to learn. So these are concerns of mine which actually permeate my everyday life. I mean, I try and be a meditative person, be a focused, centered person. And I'll admit, of course, I have a daily zazen practice. I practice Zen meditation every day, as well as other forms of meditation. I do Tai Chi, for instance, every day. So these are aspects of sort of everyday life, just at an individual level now, that also are reflected for me, or not able to be separated from this Shugyo, from the discipline of shakuhachi and Shugyo of composition. So for me, they're all sort of facets of the one thing. How that reflects in how one relates to other people. Well, I didn't talk in the book about my personal relationships or anything like that because it's not relevant to what I was trying to do. But of course, when I'm engaging with other people, either at home with my wife or with other people outside of my immediate family circle. I try and do that with a sense of centeredness and focus as well. I'm not always successful. I'm capable of getting angry like everyone else and so on. But at least trying. Yeah. So that is also a dimension, the personal dimension in daily life and interpersonal dimension in daily life. But there's also a sort of an inter-musical dimension from the one-pointedness out to an entire piece. And then also from another aspect of interpersonal dimension, as a shugyo, as a discipline, when I'm playing, the fundamental assumption, or what I wanted to have as my fundamental assumption, which Corona more or less destroyed, was the idea of playing for people, playing in a situation where I'm giving something to an audience, and you receive something back from the audience as well. So this is also a movement outwards from the sort of one-pointedness that I have to take to play, out to the external world, which also then reflects inwards. So this, for me, is also part of this process of moving inwards, but also moving outwards at the same time, communicating, giving something through the performing, which for me is also a form of discipline. The idea of, if you take into classical Zen, canon, the bodhisattva of compassion, compassionate action, action to liberate all beings. For me, playing shakuhachi, playing electronics, whatever, composing, creating it in real time as improvisation, whatever, can be, if done with, I hope the right mindset, a form of compassionate giving. Sharing this focus in the moment, which is actually a liberating thing. It's where suffering, unsatisfactoriness, disappears, becomes less relevant, or let's say becomes less relevant. It's actually part of process of sharing that, which is the action of compassionate action towards liberation. So for me, it's also the act of composing, performing, the act of personal life is part of what I try, with varying degrees of success, of course, to live as a form of compassionate action, liberating action. So it's part of a quite openly admitted as a Buddhist practice for me. I make no secret of that.
Yeah. It's very, very interesting. It's very fascinating. In the Shakuhachi world, I have the impression that on the one hand, there is a lot of fascination about the link with Zen, but most people are quite reluctant to really share their experiences with Shakuhachi and Zen, or at least I've not really come across many people who are willing to talk about that. So this is very interesting. One thing I've heard about long-time practitioners of Zen is that so when you start out on this process, there is quite a clear distinction between your meditation on the cushion and then being out in the world. And the longer you do it, it just becomes the same.
The more interpenetrating those two aspects become.
And I was just wondering, so of course, you've practiced Zen for a long time. Do you experience the same thing? And also on the musical level, does it make a difference if you're in a big cathedral, let's say, playing for 500 people, or if you're just at home in your room and you play for yourself? So maybe, I don't know, maybe this is a bit of a wonky analogy, but I was thinking practicing at home is a bit like sitting on the cushion, and doing a big performance is like being out in the world. And so over time, maybe this becomes a bit more intertwined or the same.
Yeah, there is a continuum between these two. But for me, there are also aspects of the same thing again. You're performing, when you're practicing, of course, you should be practicing again with the moment-to-moment focus. You don't sit practicing watching a film on television at the same time or something like that. At least I hope not. I don't anyway. So the process of focusing in order to play is the same, but the resonance, of course, is different. You have the spatial resonance of, say, a wonderful cathedral sound, but also my experience as a performer is that you feel a resonance returning to you from the people who are listening as well. So there is a different feel, but it's not an antithesis. It's a continuum between the two. Ultimately, it's a bit of a platitude in Zen. The other is no other than yourself. But ultimately, that's what, for me, you feel when you're performing, if it's working. That there is a sense of unity, a sense of melding together with the audience, where this the other and you, this identity comes about. The separateness falls away, and so that's something that you're trying to. Not achieve. Achieve is a terrible word. Sometimes something that you're trying to embody in meditating on your cushion, but also sometimes something that you're trying to embody when playing as well. It's just that it's a different field within which that takes place. At least that's my experience, and it's an experience which has, admittedly, deepened. According to with the passing of years, I make no claims that I'm at the end point or any sort of end point of this process. And in fact, no one should make that claim. It's an ongoing process. But it's something which is changed, shifted, developed, I hope, in the course of my life.
It's very, very interesting. So I know we're already way over time, but maybe one last question. I think any discussion of shakuhachi or music without and then without mentioning the Komuso is, of course, incomplete, even though I have the impression that Komuso are a bit more of a cliche in the shakuhachi world these days than that there is actual, or there is a lot of substance to it. Because it's also temporally quite far away these days, and there is not really the Komuso culture does not really exist in this form anymore. But at the same time, what's always reported is that they used shakuhachi as a form of meditation, and in a way, sitting on the cushion, blowing the shakuhachi is sort of just the same thing. Of course, you can make a distinction, but basically it's just two forms of meditation, as there are many other forms of meditation in Buddhism and in Zen. So, I don't know, is there a sense in which you see yourself in this tradition? Of course, you're not a monk, you don't live in a monastery.
No, I'm not a monk, I'm not a Komuso.
But is there
a musician who has a practice as meditation? Yeah, I would see the process of meditation with the shakuhachi as not being the exclusive property of Komuso or those who call themselves Yu Komuso or whatever. Certainly, it's possible to use the shakuhachi using the very traditional material, using jinashi instruments or whatever, as a form of meditation. But I don't think it's the exclusive property of people who do that. And I'm obviously not a person who does that. But I would consider that the meditative quality, potentially, is the same, can be the same. I've heard Komuso-type performances where I think that can't possibly be meditative. I've heard performances by people who have no particular relationship to Komuso or not even shakuhachi, where I think that's truly a meditation. I think it's also interesting, and something that we shouldn't forget, that ultimately the Honkyoku, even in the earliest forms that we can find, the early scores, they're structured pieces. Someone actually, at some point, somehow created, let's not call it composed, but created these pieces, and there are potentially the sets of interrelationships of pitches within them which allow them to be looked at as compositions. And there are, and I quote them in the book, texts by Komuso pointing out that you really have to play with technique. Now, you only play with technique to make sure that all the pitches are right and all the timbres are right and so on. Firstly, there are these wonderful pieces of music that are the Honkyoku. Someone created these pieces of music, not just collections of individual notes or phrases or tones, but created pieces of music. Mm-hmm. There were extremely good musicians amongst the people who were the Komuso who were meditating with the Shakuhachi. And there are calls amongst the Komuso for people to actually be sure about their technique, pay attention to their technique, even if your flute's limited, make sure that you do your best to get the pitches right, and so on and so on. Yeah. So there were Honkyoku playing Komuso who were concerned about making sure that this musical side was there as well. The two aren't mutually exclusive, and I think that the meditative side is definitely not exclusively the property of the Komuso, although identifiably there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So in a way, you're on a similar trajectory, adding more modern means by integrating electronics. Yeah. Would that be a fair assessment?
Yeah, that would be an adequate way of saying it. I mean, I actually said it once, physically, verbally, in 2019. I can remember the situation. It was at the ESS summer school that Kikude organized in Denmark. Now, the teacher at that did actually come from a fairly conservative form, the Japanese teacher. And in the opening introductory round that we had, he said, I play old spiritual music. Okay, fair enough. No argument with that. Then, when my turn came, I presented my standpoint and said, I play new spiritual music.
Great.
That was how I felt.
I like that. That's a very nice way of seeing it, I think. Great.
So that was where I came from. That's where I am. That's what I was doing.
Yeah.
That's what I am doing.
Very nice. So thank you very much. We've run way over time. Thank you for taking the time. I could ask many more questions. It's really fascinating for me what you've done and hear you talk. But maybe for this interview we'll call it the day. So thank you again.
Thank you for taking the time to read the book and to ask me the questions.
Oh no, it was my pleasure. As I say, my interests are very similar, even though I don't have a background in composition, but my interests are very similar. So it was fascinating for me to hear your perspective on everything.
Yep. Well, thank you for asking.